In Tainted Grail, the Fall of Avalon, through a combination of fate, dumb luck, and a little something special that only you have, you find yourself in the presence of the fragment of the soul of Arthur Pendragon, the once and future king. And whether you like it or not, you're thrusted upon the mission to accompany him on a journey to become whole again, so that he can come to the aid of his kingdom like he has done so many times before. Over the course of said journey, Arthur revisits his past and pieces together some parts of it that he had no memory of, and in the process, he also comes to the realization that the utopian kingdom that he sought to build eventually crumbled under the weight of a complex reality that he didn't always handle in the best way. Arthur claimed the lands of Avalon so that people from the homelands could escape the plague known as the Red Death. A noble deed for sure, but when he did what everyone who's ever claimed someone else's land has ever done. He convinced those who were amenable to his vision to rally under his banner. He offered to those he couldn't convince something in return for the part they would play in the war, and he straight out coerced those he couldn't convince or buy. And this is how you win a war, but it's also how you leave a long trail of injustices behind. Over the course of the war, Arthur came close to losing several times, and to make the winds of war blow in his favor again, he resorted to actions that would have been considered war crimes in our times. Knowing that Arthur's people would have not forgiven him for these actions, some of his most trustworthy men decided to take the blame in his place, because the people needed to believe in their king. Arthur needed to be a symbol to his people, and so he became one. And that's why his followers keep bringing him back from the land of the dead every time they believe the kingdom is on the verge of collapse. And here you are, carrying a fragment of the soul of a monarch whose kingdom was built on a lie, facing the threat of an all-consuming, all-corrupting fog that changes every creature it claims into a twisted remnant of what it once was. A strange phenomenon that mirrors what Arthur's own quest to conquer Avalon and raise a kingdom eventually became. And that's how you embark upon Arthur's last journey. He has given you the task to help him become whole again, so that he can make the most out of his last chance to make things right. But those who helped you escape your prison cell before you tripped on fate and ended up pulling Arthur out of his, have a different plan. They want you to put an end to Arthur's cycle of death and rebirth and give Avalon the reins of its own destiny. You have been thrusted upon greatness, and there is nothing you can do about it. You will have to step into the king's shoes and make decisions that will impact an entire kingdom, that feel larger than any human can handle, and that will make you feel small and overwhelmed. You will see how hard it is to be Arthur, and how easy it is to judge him now that the consequences of his actions have become readily obvious. And speaking of readily obvious, Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon is the best game of the year 2025 so far, in my opinion. And I don't see any other title snatching that honor away from it in what remains of the year. Hell, it's one of the best games to come out in the last 10 years, and that's why I think labeling it an Arthurian Elder Scrolls type of game, like so many have done recently, is doing this game a great disservice, because it is a heck of a lot more than that. Those who seek to have that old Elder Scrolls itch scratched may or may not be satisfied with Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon's mechanics, but I would personally hate it if you missed out on this game because you are not a big fan of the Elder Scrolls, or because someone said it is janky. I am pretty sure that by the end of the quest that takes place in the Abyss of Sagramore, you will be having a hard time remembering anything so goddamn memorable since the best quests you did in The Witcher's 3 expansions. Actually, you know what? How about you come back to this video and leave a comment to tell me what you think about this quest once you're finished with it. And by the end of the Ulfor quest in the Forlorn Swords, you'll be laughing at the time in which you were doubtful about this game. Because yeah, it is that fucking epic. Unlike many other games that have come out in the last decade, this title is clearly not some desperate attempt to throw shit at the wall in the hopes that it sticks, made by a company who needs to score a hit and sell millions of copies before the hype of the game dies out and users move on to the most recent, most talked about game. Awakened Realms is clearly in for the long haul with the Tainted Grail intellectual property. This is the second video game made by this company based on the IP, and telling by the devotion and effort they've put into making these games better long after their initial release, I think they have no intentions of dropping it if the next game does not become a massive success overnight. And I presume they are as committed to this IP as they are, because they know they have something good on their hands. Tainted Grail's world is not some shallow, run-of-the-mill collection of locations, characters, and events that were pulled out of someone's hat so that a plot had a setting where it could happen. Awakened Realms doesn't fuck around with Tainted Grail's lore. The game's various locations, the characters that you meet, the creatures that you face in combat, the events that serve as backdrop to the main story and to the various secondary stories and quests, and the ever-present threads of the weirdness and the Red Death are all faithful renditions of the original tabletop elements, and they are the pillars upon which these games have been built. Arthurian Dark Fantasy has been around for a while, of course, but Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon is not the latest lazy sequel, prequel, or requel of some tired old IP that has been bastardized beyond recognition. Like those narrow-minded, short-sighted fools who have tried to bring Arthur back by focusing on the part of his soul that they thought they needed to tackle the problem at hand, there are some writers out there who apparently believe that they are better than the legendary IP they've been entrusted with. And so they treat the soul of said IP like a tavern platter, picking only the cut that suits their appetite. They invoke iconic characters, locations, and objects from the original words, believing that in doing so, their job of engaging the fans is done. They also do this in the hope that these icons will legitimize their own crappy vision. But like Orin understood that King Arthur's soul could not be restored by drawing on the aspects that were believed to be needed at the time, Awakened Realms draws on everything that makes the Tainted Grail IP great, and it gives us an open-world RPG worthy of the brand. So, I think I have made it abundantly clear how I feel about the game. Take it as the short version of my review if you wish, but if you know this channel, you know short reviews aren't really my thing, so let's get down to business. Welcome to Ye Olde Entertainment. My name is Alex, and as you know, it is my duty, my mission, my purpose in life to help you decide whether that game that you have been plucking daisies about for so long is indeed the right game for you or not. And as some of you know, I review games using a system of categories that I consider to be relevant to the genre of the game at hand. And the game at hand today is Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon, a first-person open-world RPG that takes place in an Arthurian Dark Fantasy setting. And when it comes to those, character creation and character progression are up first. We have said it before and we will say it again, a good character creation and progression system puts you in the driver's seat of your character, and it lets you engage with the various aspects of the game in a way that takes into account the decisions you make pertaining your character's progression. Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon's gameplay mix consists of combat, exploration, questing, and a few other secondary aspects. And as always, the question is, does the game's character progression system give you the opportunity to engage with these things in a way that's unique to your choices? Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon features a classless system. At the beginning of the game, you create a character and you get to choose its gender and his or her name. You also get a few cosmetic options to customize your character, but not much else. When the game starts, a prison guard asks you a few questions about your past, and this little interrogation feels like a very simplified version of that initial interview you got in Morrowind. And it feels like this because the guard only gets the chance to ask you a couple of questions before he kicks the bucket. The answer to the first question effectively translates into a choice of playstyle. You can choose to start your journey as a warrior-like type of character, a dexterity-based combatant, or a magic user. And the second question translates into a choice of archetype, more or less. And while you don't have to stick to that playstyle and archetype until the weirdness claims you, these initial choices will very heavily influence your combat capabilities for a good chunk of the game, because the initial bonuses that you get are quite significant. Leveling up in Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon works much like it does in those post-Daggerfall Elder Scrolls games. You gain experience by killing things, discovering new places, completing quests, and even for leveling up your abilities. Once you reach a certain threshold, you level up and you get an attribute point that you can spend on strength, dexterity, endurance, spirituality, or perception, and a skill point that you can spend on one of the game's multiple talent trees, which are conveniently categorized by the associated attribute. So for example, under the Dexterity tab in your skill panel you have bow, movement, parry, and attack speed, which are skills that obviously depend on dexterity. The bow skill tree, for example, is very similar to the one you had in Skyrim, meaning that it consists mostly of passive bonuses that make you hit harder or use less stamina or attack faster. Mostly. I know there are a few exceptions here and there. Spells were a notable exception to this rule in the Elder Scrolls series, and they are a notable exception in Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon too. Spells do add new combat capabilities, and they can change your approach to combat quite significantly. You need to find them and equip them as though they were weapons to be able to use them. And some of them can be quite difficult to find. And if I'm honest with you, I prefer this system considerably, because it rewards players for defeating difficult enemies and for going off the beaten trail and exploring abandoned villages and ruins. But speaking of going off the beaten trail and earning your magic knowledge, I much prefer Outward's progression system when it comes to your skills. In Outward you don't level up, but your exploration endeavors can take you to the far confines of the world, where there's always someone willing to teach you something new, be it a spell or a combat discipline. And combat disciplines work like actual skills, which means that you use them during combat encounters. So you don't just hit harder, move faster, or withstand more damage as your character gets better. You learn some actual new ways of fighting. There is a secret talent tree that you can unlock over the course of the game, but I won't be spoiling it for you. I'll just say that it improves your combat capabilities, but it doesn't really have to do with any other aspect of the gameplay. In Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon, just as it happens in the Elder Scrolls series, you have abilities like sneaking, theft, handcrafting, alchemy, etc. And they have an impact on the efficiency of the associated discipline or action, of course. You level up these abilities by simply using them. Realistic, yes, but not very fun if you ask me. I kept hopping around like a maniac or sneaking about when I didn't need to, just to level up these abilities and gain some experience in the process. Which brought me back to the times when I played Morrowind. I don't think this system is bad for all abilities though. I think it's fine for stuff like cooking, alchemy, and handcrafting. It's fine because you don't do these things all the time and they require resources, so you cannot really exploit the system. But for abilities like athletics and agility, which is mostly running and jumping, I find it completely pointless. Now don't get me wrong, I don't think that a level 1 character and a level 50 character should be able to run equally fast or jump equally high. I think you should earn being good at these things, of course. I just don't think a game should encourage you to jump around like an idiot and sprint everywhere to level up these things. I think they could have used a less tedious mechanic like trainers that you could find and convince or pay, or for whom you needed to do a quest or something along those lines. Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon's character progression system puts you squarely in the driver's seat of your character's build as far as his or her combat capabilities go. But what about the other aspects of the game? Well, when it comes to questing, some of the most important main and secondary quests can potentially have very different outcomes depending on who you side with or what you choose to do. You may kill any NPC in the game and completely forego the whole conversation if your policy is to shoot first and ask questions later, or if you engage Reddit user mode and decide that you don't want to listen to the other side of the story. But if you choose the less barbaric approach and decide to actually talk to the NPCs in the game, you'll notice that you sometimes have dialogue choices that depend on an attribute. Some of these choices are only clickable if you meet the minimum attribute requirement, and some others are RNG dependent skills, which I think is very interesting. I of course prefer systems in which the likelihood of success in a conversation depends on skills like persuasion and intimidation, and I especially like when being good at these things comes at the expense of you being good at something else. Fallout New Vegas is a good example of an open-world first-person RPG that used skill-based mechanics for conversations and quests. These skill-based mechanics were part of the game's character progression system, and it was one of the factors that made players feel like they had more agency over the outcome of the game's various missions. Also, breaking and entering into people's homes, pickpocketing valuable shit, and murdering some people in their sleep to complete a quest were things that you probably found yourself doing quite frequently in the Elder Scrolls series. And that's because in these games, these shady practices were presented as viable and very rewarding alternatives to straightforward approaches like combat or persuasion. But these fun, yet dubious practices, while technically possible in Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon, they aren't really worth doing most of the times. In fact, a lot of the people that you have to kill in the game don't ever go to sleep. Also, for the final region of the game, almost none of the items that you can get from people's homes are considered stolen. It's like the devs at some point said, fuck it, and ditched stealing as a concept altogether. As for the exploration aspect of the game, getting better at jumping does allow you to move around and access places a little bit more swiftly, which is nice. Your character doesn't have any special skills or combat abilities that you can use for exploration purposes, like those teleportation items and skills that you had in Divinity Original Sin 2 or Baldur's Gate 3, which allowed you to access certain places through alternative means, or those mid-air sword attacks that moved your character forward and made you float in Elden Ring, or the ice platform that you could conjure if you were a mage in Dragon's Dogma, which allowed you to reach a shortcut that would spare you at least an hour of wandering about in the forest. But there is this one area near the end of the game that I couldn't figure out how to get to. And after many hours of wandering about aimlessly, I decided to go back to a settlement, brew one of those featherfall potions, and just jump my way down through a series of chasms until I reached my destination. And that felt super rewarding. So, summarizing combat-wise, chances are you are going to find the game's character progression system more than sufficient. And depending on the build that you go for, you might even find it awesome. But other aspects of the gameplay aren't as player choice dependent as they could be. All in all, it is what it needs to be given the type of game Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon is, but I wish it had been a little bit deeper. Gameplay. If you haven't played this game since the early days of its early access stage, you are in for a treat. Every aspect of the game has been overhauled and improved, and mechanics that originally made you wonder why they were in the game have been reworked into something amazing. Now the game feels dangerous. It feels like something really bad is going to happen if you don't do something about it fast. And unlike other games I could mention, Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon actually expects you to figure out some of its challenges. Some of it is by design and some of it isn't, but it's great fun all the same. I think Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon is one of those cases in which the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. But as tradition dictates, we are going to be talking about the parts, so let's start with combat. Combat is very interesting in Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon. To me, this doesn't have to be your opinion. It feels like a more polished, tighter version of the combat you had in the Elder Scrolls series. You have intense yet deceptively tactical melee skirmishes, you have super satisfying ranged combat, and interesting magic that goes beyond your average pew 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 spells. Weapons have a great deal of tactical value in this game. You have various different types of weapons, and they all have strengths and weaknesses that make each of them ideal for certain situations and not the best choice for some others. And just because the game loves you, it provides you with 4 different weapon loadouts, so that you can be ready for all combat situations. Spears, for example, do decent damage, have decent speed, and great reach. They are the best choice when you need to keep enemies at bay in situations in which you are being chased by a group of fairly slow enemies that favor melee attacks. It is a decent tactic to walk backwards while you thrust them with your spear and take them down one by one. But for pesky zigzaggy enemies like these nasty redcaps, spears are definitely not the best choice. Knives do little damage and have little reach, but they are quick, they consume little stamina, and they can be used to easily overwhelm the enemy and prevent him or her from taking action. Clubs, maces, and hammers are slow as hell, but they hit really hard, stagger enemies, and penetrate armor. So they are really good against slow, heavily armored enemies. But more importantly, weapons feel good to use, and the best part is that you need to adjust your combat tactics to make the most out of them, and that makes them very interesting in my book. Bows can be insanely powerful if you favor dexterity and bow talent, and one-shotting enemies in this game has become one of the most satisfying gaming experiences of the year so far. Even some of you let a couple of wows and damned when you were watching me play over on CBS. But if you go for a purely magic-based build, you don't even have to concern yourself with weapons. You will have to decide what kind of magic user you want to be and choose your skills and spells accordingly. Also, the game encourages you to think about tactics. Look at this Beautiful situation here. I ordered my summoned keepers to shoot the bad guys from a distance, causing them to leave their entrenched position and charge. I waited patiently in cover until I had a visual of the bad guys and flanked them from a safe distance with magical attacks. You can also use magic to cheese your enemies. No, literally, this spell turns your enemies into cheese. Yup, this is a thing in this game. But magic can also be used in hybrid builds, and there are a fuck ton of epic badass weapons and armor pieces that are meant to be used in hybrid builds. Be warned though, some of them will have you dabbling in cross-dressing. But I'm okay with it because I would definitely look better than my character wearing that outfit. Take for example this one-hand sword that you find early on in the game. It hurls an icy projectile when you do a heavy attack and consumes mana when it does instead of stamina. I'm not gonna lie guys, I am very impressed with the itemization aspect of the game. We already mentioned how weapons have tactical value because this game puts you through different combat situations, and making the most out of each weapon type requires you to understand their strengths and weaknesses and the scenarios each of them is most useful for. But in addition to that, you can upgrade your weapons in various ways. You have the most boring form of upgrade of course, which is the flat stat increment. But you can also attach relics to your weapons, and this is where it gets interesting because relics do all kinds of things in this game. Some add poison damage, some add the burn status, some increase sneak damage, etc. There's also no shortage of special weapons and armor, and I'm not talking about weapons and armors that have specially high stats or bonuses to this or that attribute. I'm talking about weapons that have special skills, like that sword we mentioned. And those items are hardly exceptions, you find a ton of them over the course of the game. The best part is that these items are just not flat out good or bad. They are good or bad depending on your character's build and on the various situations that you encounter. And this means that items constitute a very important part of your character's build, and this is something that you love to see in an RPG. But when it comes to combat, what your character is capable of doing is only a part of the equation. So what about the bad guys? Are they any good? Well, the game does have a tendency to recycle some enemy types across its various regions. Drowners, redcaps, bears, wolves, and undead are present in all of the game's regions, and the only difference across their multiple presentations is the amount of damage that they can take. Because yes, in Tainted Grail, the Fall of Avalon, enemies do not get stronger as you level. Enemy difficulty is tied to the region and not to your progression. And I, for one, am thankful that they chose not to go the Elder Scrolls way in this particular respect. But the game has a very broad array of regular and elite enemies that will force you to think about new combat tactics. You have enemies that are precise and deadly with a bow, you have enemies with oddly timed attacks, you have enemies that do damage over time, enemies that explode upon taking damage, enemies that summon adds, lightning fast enemies that zigzag like crazy, enemies that have AoE attacks, enemies that summon clouds of mist, etc. And the game's level design makes things even more interesting in many situations. You better take Ra's al Ghul's advice on this one.
Always mind your surroundings.
Because you are going to be fighting in closed off spaces, Devil May Cry style when it's time to face a boss, narrow bridges in high altitudes where you can fall off to your death if you aren't careful, and places where there are structures that you can use to your advantage. Now you have to be warned about something. At first it might seem like the game has huge difficulty spikes here and there, but it's more due to the fact that some bosses are significantly easier or harder depending on your character's build. This boss, for example, killed me several times during my first playthrough when I was using a bow-based build. But for my second playthrough I went with a magic build that focused heavily on summons, and I cruised past the same boss as though it weren't there. But with this other boss the situation was the exact opposite. I don't know if this is true of every build, but one problem that I particularly ran into was that by the time I was halfway through the game, I had already ironed out all my go-to tactics. I already had the best gear for my strategic approach, almost all the best skills and spells I needed, and just enough points allocated to the right attributes to make my strategy work. So from then on out, I cruised through 85% of the encounters by relying on my tried and true formulas over and over and over again, hardly ever having to step out of my comfort zone. The final stretch of the game was particularly bad in this respect, because enemies are super damage spongy, but they don't really do anything to force you to adjust your tactics. So I killed them just as easily, but it took me 3 or 4 times longer. Again, do consider I was using a combination of summons and pew pew magic. Now let's talk about questing in Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon. It's mostly really good, but there are a lot of filler quests in the game, and many of them are presented very soon and all at once. I can't see a lot of people getting a negative impression about the questing aspect of the game early on. See, after the now totally awesome initial stretch of the game, you find yourself on the shores of Avalon. Almost everything you've been told and almost every quest you have been given up until that point has to do with the stronghold known as the Horns of the South. So while you can technically go anywhere and do whatever you want, there's a good chance that you are going to go to the Horns of the South to learn a little bit more about what's going on and about what you have to do. And if you do this is probably one of the first guys that you are going to talk to, and he immediately asks you to prepare a dish that his mother used to cook for him when he was a kid, because he's feeling nostalgic about it. And not long after that, you meet a keeper who is feeling cold because he has been assigned to a windy post. But because he's no longer on speaking terms with the blacksmith, the guy can't ask the smith to make a coat for him, so he asks you to fetch one for him. And not long after that, you meet this guy who is obsessed with seagulls, because they keep shitting on everything everywhere. And your conversation with him starts a long, boring quest line to help him deal with the problem. You also meet this guy who wants you to read a letter that he got from his sister. And what do you get out of all of this? A few hundred experience points, maybe one extra level in handcrafting, maybe an extra level in cooking, and a shitty cooking recipe for the worst meal in the game. You don't get a single decent item, you don't get money, you don't even get any relevant information about the world of Avalon, its people, or the weirdness. All of which are very cool things that you would like to know more about. The problem is that these characters and their quest are presented all together at a time in which all you want to do is to get the quest collecting phase out of the way as soon as possible so that you can go out there and explore some of those awesome looking places that you saw in the distance on your way here. At some point before, during, or after you meet this collection of fools, you get to talk to Feargas. Yup, that's his name. They couldn't think of a better name. Anyways, Feargas is supposed to be the most important NPC in the Horns of the South, the guy who's going to give you all the important quests and whatnot. But there's nothing even remotely remarkable about this guy. His lines are exposition dumpy and boring, his voice acting is bland, and the things he asks you to do don't sound awfully exciting either, though some of them are, to be fair. Not a very good start to your adventure in the world of Avalon, is it? Fortunately, the game gets better as it goes, and even some of these seemingly generic quests that you get at the Horns of the South unfold in very interesting ways. But in my opinion, the game starts hitting its stride halfway through the first region, when some of these quests start tying into matters that are of great importance to Avalon. Some of the decisions I made over the course of the game felt so big that I wished I could have entrusted them to someone else. You know the phrase, "This is way above my pay grade"? Well, that's how I felt in this game from time to time. And that's great. This is a game in which you feel the weight of the entire kingdom on your shoulders at all times. And this gives the game and your choices a sense of gravitas that I hadn't felt in a game in a long time. Many of the most important decisions that you make over the course of the game have to do with Avalonian politics, and with the various factions that are at conflict with each other, and you might feel like you are shaping Avalon's political landscape with your choices, and maybe you are. But your travels will sometimes require you to go beyond the boundaries of the physical world and enter otherworldly planes of reality, and the things that you have to deal with in these places makes every political major conspiracy that you've taken a part in feel petty, and the creatures and entities that you meet in these realms make every high lord, knight, and chieftain in Avalon seem insignificant. These quests drip creativity, their subtext is thought-provoking, and the decisions you make during these missions are weighty and difficult. And in my book, along with some other things that we're going to talk about later, they make Tainted Grail stand head and shoulders above its peers. But not every quest in Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon is epic and world-changing. Sometimes you have to do smaller things for regular people. And even those quests, many of which structurally are nothing more than fetch quests, add a great deal to the world building aspect of the game, because they all serve to tell you a little more about things like the Red Death, or the weirdness, or the tensions between the various factions of the game, and about how these things affect the people of Avalon in their daily lives, and I think they are brilliant. In Tainted Grail, the Fall of Avalon, you have the Alchemist Guild and the Stone Wardens, which is a Dalriatan order of blacksmiths. These groups ask you to do a series of quests that serve as tests to see if you have what it takes to be a part of them. I think this is meant to be the game's version of the guilds you had in the Elder Scrolls series. But in the Elder Scrolls series, guilds felt like a very important part of the game. In Skyrim, for example, the Bards and the Thieves guild questlines were amongst the most memorable things in the game. But in Tainted Grail, the Fall of Avalon, these groups feel almost like an afterthought. They feel like someone had walked into the office and said, "Guys, what about the guilds? We haven't put anything similar in our game yet." And so the devs put together a couple of lazy fetch quests for the Alchemist Guild and a couple of shit-crafting quests for the Stone Wardens. I mean, these quest lines have their moments, but they still feel like dollar store Elder Scroll Guild Me Too's. There is, however, a little something that I absolutely loved in this game. Something that you don't get too often in games anymore. Let's say that you've finished a quest that had to do with an NPC, so he or she doesn't have anything else to say to you. But then you start a different quest, one that doesn't have anything to do with said NPC. The guy or gal isn't even mentioned in the description of the quest, but because of the people involved in this new quest, or because of the mission objectives themselves, you feel like said quest would be of interest to the NPC we talked about. Well, if you ever get this feeling in this game, go and talk to the guy or gal, because he or she might have something new to say to you, and that new conversation might even lead to a new secret quest, or at least it might give you a different perspective on things. Also, some quests even branch out in ways that I wasn't expecting. A couple of times I was curious enough to load a saved game that I had made before an important decision, just to choose a different dialogue option to see how things turned out. And I was pleasantly surprised to see different outcomes every time I did this. Let me tell you about this little side quest that you can do early on in the game. It's a spoiler, yes,
but it's a sacrifice I am willing to make.
And I think it'll give you a good idea about what to expect from quests in Tainted Grail, the Fall of Avalon. Don't worry, I will add a time code so that you can skip it if you want. So there is this unsufferable noble lady from Camelot who is sitting around at the table in the Horns of the South. Her name is Elisa. When you meet her, she sees you as some lowly peasant barely even worth talking to, and she makes little effort to hide it. She tells you that she's accompanying her very important husband, Duncan, on a very important business trip. And she tells you that she's tired of spending her nights at the local inn, that her noble status demands fitting lodgings. So she asks you to clear out some unwelcome guests from an abandoned estate that she's planning to buy. When you successfully clear out the unwelcome guest and go back to the tavern to give her the good news, her annoyed husband Duncan pays you for your services, and that's that. The quest is marked as finished, Elisa can no longer be found at the tavern, and there is no real reason for you to go back to that house by the beach. But if you go there out of curiosity, or because you're close by when the weirdness comes and you decide to take shelter from it there, you'll find that Elisa has moved to the house, and if you talk to her, she gives you a new quest. This time she tells you that she has received a letter from a group of bandits who have supposedly kidnapped her husband. I like that the game is not on the nose about it, but you can immediately tell that something is not quite right about this letter. So if you go to the place where the bandits are supposedly holding Duncan captive, you find out that it's all a ruse. It was a plot that Duncan cooked up to get away from Elisa, because divorcing her would have been much more troublesome. And the reasons with which he justifies his actions, telling by what you know about Elisa by that moment, make all the sense in the world. So Duncan asks you to lie to Elisa and tell her that he was murdered by bandits and eaten by the local wildlife. He even stupidly cuts off one of his fingers for you to show her as proof. So if you go back to Elisa and rat Duncan out and tell her the truth, she chooses not to believe you and she dismisses you almost immediately, and the quest is over and marked as finished successfully. But if you tell her that Duncan was killed and eaten and show her his finger as proof, she reluctantly believes you and reveals that her marriage with Duncan was made out of pure convenience. She's evidently not heartbroken over the loss of Duncan and seems more concerned about what to do next. She tells you she's thinking about selling the house and moving back to Camelot. At that point you can choose to buy the house from Elisa and give her some advice about what she should do in the future. This dialogue choice ends the quest. But you can also convince her to stay in Avalon and start a new life. Since she's into haute couture, you can convince her to start her own fashion business. This triggers a long succession of fetch quests. And you not only get a very decent set of clothes with surprisingly good stats at the end of them, but you'll also notice how every time you complete one of the quests, Lady Elisa has something nicer to say to you every time. Once you are done with all the quests, you can even repair a shack near the house and turn it into a decent gazebo with a great view of the shore. Once you build the gazebo, you can ask Elisa out on a date, a picnic at the gazebo. Elisa enthusiastically agrees to spend some time with you at the gazebo, not without criticizing some of your decoration choices, of course. You then have a nice conversation with her about the places you've been to and the people you've met. This conversation varies greatly depending on the quests you've done and the people you've met up until that point, which I think is awesome. You are also given the choice to flirt with her a little. So later that day, if you decide to go back to her house, Elisa finally confesses that she likes you. She says that she wouldn't be opposed to a kiss, and she even tells you that you can live with her if you wish. At that point, you can tell Elisa that you feel the same way about her, and you can take her up on her offer, or you can tell her that you're not into her. If you choose to live with her, she will have a series of tasks that have to do with repairing the estate to make it look better. And if I'm honest with you, I really like how the place ends up looking, not gonna lie. But I would have liked if these upgrades had come with an alchemy station, a handcrafting bench, and a cooking pot. Elisa will even give you a little something for you to wear or sell every 2 or 3 days once you are finished with her questline. So as you can see, you come upon various crossroads in this questline, and many options end the quest immediately, and not in a way that feels like a failure or a middle of the road ending. But if you choose your words and actions carefully, you can end up unlocking lengthy quests with lots of quest rewards and even cutscenes. And I only chose to spoil this particular quest because it has little impact in the grand scheme of things. It's even a little bit goofy, but there are other much more important quests in which your choices matter every bit as much as they do in this one, and that can segue into longer quests depending on what you say. Make no mistake about it though, questing in Tainted Grail the Fall of Avalon isn't what it is in Tyranny or Fallout New Vegas. I mean, in Tainted Grail, you still have to touch upon certain milestones, and there are times in which the game kind of forces you to commit to a previous decision you made. For example, this character and his entourage will only be at this location if you have had a certain conversation with another NPC. In Fallout New Vegas, you could talk to almost any NPC at any time, and quests were designed in a way that your conversations with said NPCs would change depending on the people you had talked to previously and or on your current missions. But while there aren't as many branching story paths in Tainted Grail the Fall of Avalon as there are in these other games, the way in which quests play out and the outcomes that result from your decisions are so freaking rewarding that I very much look forward to playing the game again to see how things turn out if I take different decisions. I do have one rather big issue with the main quest in the final region of the game and with the secondary missions that stem out of it. Some of them are great, epic even, but in these missions you work towards building something big. I expected these quests to set the stage for a glorious, epic confrontation against the faction you chose to oppose. And I did not get the expected payoff. I had the build-up, but not the payoff. I had to read about what transpired in the final succession of stills, and that was a little bit frustrating. Before we move on to the next thing, however, I need to tell you about all the letters, books, and journals that you find over the course of the adventure. Seriously, guy, I am the kind of guy who reads every piece of in-game lore he finds in an RPG, but 95% of the times I walk away disappointed. I usually find in-game books to be boring, pretentious, and just not useful. I can count with the fingers of one hand the games in which reading in-game books has been worth it, and Tainted Grail the Fall of Avalon is definitely one of those, and it's very near the top. The way in which the game tells you the story of Katrine, Urfa's wife for example, is simply masterful. You piece it together by reading her letters, some experiment logs, and by simply paying a little bit of attention to your surroundings. Reading the gruesome experiment logs at the island asylum will definitely have an impact on your disposition towards every red priest. even the friendly ones. Orin's journal will give you a new perspective on your one big mission, and it might even change your mind about what to do about it. And then you have the absolutely brilliantly hilarious series of erotic novels about Liliana's adventures. If these books don't get at least a chuckle out of you, nothing will. These books, journals, and letters elevate the quality of the quests in Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon in a way that I hadn't experienced since Trials of the Lure Master in the Icewind Dale expansion Heart of Winter. Now let's talk about exploration. I enjoyed the ever-living hell about the exploration aspect of the game in Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon. The game's topography isn't as elaborate as it is, for example, in Elex. The world doesn't feel as vast as the collection of planets you get to explore in Everspace 2, and it's lacking the emergent gameplay quality of Elden Ring. But the ambiance in Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon is absolutely magnificent, and it makes me want to explore its world to the last inch. The game's locations feel dangerous and intriguing, and there is always a little something for you to do or to look at everywhere. And it's not like you can't jump around and find shortcuts or multiple ways to access the game's various places of interest. You can. In fact, wandering off the beaten trail almost always bears fruit. Taking a deep dive underwater will often lead to the discovery of hidden tunnels at the end of which there's almost always a cave, where there's a chest or a corpse that you can loot, or simply a passageway that takes you to a place that you need to go to, or a shortcut between two distant locations. And because the game does not make it obvious that a certain topographic accident is the first breadcrumb of an exploration trail, as it happens in other games, there is an interesting feeling of discovery to the exploration aspect of the game. Also, when the game first came out during early access, dungeons were lacking the intricacy that they have in games like Skyrim or Outward. But they have been completely reworked and overhauled, and now they are one of the game's strong suits. You have different dungeons that are interconnected in elaborate ways, secret hideouts with labyrinthian layouts, and secrety secrets awaiting those with an adventurous heart. And I remember letting out a "shit that's cool" more than once when I entered a new location, which is always a good sign. I find Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon's gameplay to be fascinating. If we were to judge each individual component of the gameplay mix on its own merits, we'd probably come to the conclusion that they are fine, good, and maybe great from time to time. But we probably wouldn't rate any of them as top tier stuff. But this game is greater than the sum of its parts, and it is so because there are many things in this game that take the experience to the next level. The various diaries, manuals, and letters that you find lying about in the game's locations, for example, elevate the quality of the questing aspect of the game immensely. They are extremely well written, so they give purpose to your actions. They also add a great deal to the world building and immersion aspect of the game. The game also nails the mystery aspect of the narrative, so every time you go out to a new place because a quest requires you to go there, you are not only motivated by the quest itself, but by the need to find another little clue that'll help you piece together the greater mystery of the weirdness of which you know so little about. But of all the things that elevate the quality of the game beyond the merits of each individual component of the gameplay mix, I think the weirdness itself deserves a special mention. In Tainted Grail Conquest, the weirdness felt like an encroaching fog of madness and despair that sucked meaning, hope, and purpose out of everyone's existence. It harbored the worst fears of mankind, and it also turned every creature into the most horrifying rendition of itself. I remember being terrified of the weirdness in Conquest. I even finished the game several times and kept wondering why I hadn't completed some of the game's most important quests, until I found out by accident that some quests could only be completed by letting the weirdness take over. And I was this close to shitting my pants, I kid you not, when I walked into the weirdness without a weird candle for the first time. In Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon, it's one of the most badass concepts of the game. Just as it happened in Conquest, the weirdness is the great threat that looms over everything. It's the all-consuming entity that turns man against his brother and feeds upon the worst demons of his nature. Much as it happens with the Spirit Eater in Neverwinter Nights 2 Mask of the Betrayer, the weirdness in Tainted Grail is an antagonist, but it has also been implemented as a game mechanic to remind you of what you are up against. When the night falls in Avalon, the weirdness takes over, and I can promise you guys, you are not prepared for this. It comes with almost total darkness, harrowing sounds that'll chill you to the bone, and strange visual illusions that'll make your teeth clatter. It also transforms every creature around you into an otherworldly twisted version of itself that is significantly more aggressive and dangerous than its previous earthly form. It also summons strange, weird creatures that haunt and hunt you. Basically, it turns everything around you against you. But how does this make the game better? Well, in some sandbox RPGs, and in RPGs that lean heavily into their survival mechanics, going from place of origin A to destination B is not something that you can take for granted. It's not a mere task, it's an adventure. There are often hunger, weather, and disease mechanics to consider, and you can always get waylaid by enemies and must defend yourself. Your trip is probably going to be eventful, and you must prepare for it in advance. Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon does not have mechanics such as hunger, thirst, hypothermia, or lingering disease. It has the weirdness. If you try to walk back from, let's say, here to here while the weirdness is out, there is a good chance that you're not going to make it, and the more you progress into the game, the more dangerous the weirdness becomes. In the Horns of the South, which is the first region of the game, there are plenty of abandoned buildings and other places where you can wait the weirdness out. But in Kuanacht, which is the second region of the game, abandoned buildings with beds are scarcer. In the Forlorn Swords, which is the third region of the game, finding your way around is much harder, fast travel beacons seem scarcer, and there are hardly any spots that have a fast travel beacon, a bed, and a weird candle. So you are probably going to have to resort to your bonfires more frequently. But I think Questline and Awakened Realms unintentionally nerfed the weirdness for the 1.0 version of the game. See, in the early access version of the game, you had the video game journalist pussy difficulty, hard, survival, and hardcore. The hardcore difficulty being a bit like the survival difficulty, with permadeath thrown in for those who crave the ultimate masochistic challenge. But playing the game in the survival difficulty felt like playing the game in the Game of the Year mode, especially if you are in the habit of not using fast travel posts to crank up the immersion aspect of the game to 11. And it was awesome because the survival mode only allowed you to save at bonfires, cooking spots, and at the game's major settlements, which made the weirdness feel even more dangerous. I for one took note of the various ruins, caves, and outdoor locations where there were beds, bonfires, and cooking pots, places that I could use as temporary shelters to wait the weirdness out. But in the 1.0 version of the game, the veteran difficulty allows you to save wherever you want and whenever you want, which makes the weirdness feel less dangerous. I think they should have kept the original difficulty modes. But all in all, I had a blast with Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon. The game is not perfect, of course. Summons are still a bit too clunky and glitchy, there are a few too many filler quests, and I can't help but feel like the weirdness could have been much better with just a few tweaks in the gameplay. But the game feels epic and grand, and when it fires on all cylinders, it's capable of delivering some of the best gaming experiences of the last 10 years. And more importantly, it beats the ever-living shit out of the early access version of the game, which speaks volumes of the dev's commitment. So yeah, Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon basically fucking rocks. Story and lore. I am probably going to come off as a little bit bipolar here, especially to those who expect positive reviews of the games they like to be an endless praise to the high heavens and beyond, and the negative reviews of the games they hate to be an unmitigated shitnado. But the thing is that I love what the writers did on the story end of things, but I occasionally hated how they did it. Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon is the story of a slightly above average Joe or Jane who, through a combination of dumb luck, decent combat capabilities, and a little something special, finds him or herself mixed up with none other than the once and future king, Arthur Pendragon, or what remains of him anyways. Upon their fortuitous meeting, the main character and Arthur embark upon a journey to make Arthur whole again. But if you look at it from a certain perspective, King Arthur is the true protagonist of the story, and your character is just a plot device with decision-making power, which is absolutely awesome when done right. And it is done right in Tainted Grail, mostly. It's awesome that all of the pieces of the puzzle turn out to be more than they originally seem. There is more to Camelot than honor and valor, and those who swear by and would die for the glorious Camelot may have their beliefs and convictions challenged when and if they find out that the foundations of their glorious kingdom are not all that glorious after all. There is more to the weirdness, a lot of which you learn over the course of the game and a lot of which remains a mystery. And there is more to King Arthur himself. His journey is somewhat similar to that of the Nameless One in Planescape Torment. He is aware that he has been around before. He remembers bits and pieces of the time he came to Avalon, waged war against the Four Dwellers, and ultimately claimed their land. And he desires to be whole again so that he can see his prosperous kingdom once again. Though one suspects that the current reality of his kingdom may not match his expectations. And a little bit like the Nameless One in Planescape Torment, over the course of the game, Arthur is able to piece together his true legacy by talking to those who have survived him and by witnessing the current state of his kingdom. Your character is also there to witness these things, and near the end of the game, you meet some characters who can see Arthur inside you, and yet some others who can interact with him directly, forcing him to come clean about some of the things he did and the reasons why he did them. Running parallel to Arthur's journey of discovery, you have your story. The story of a man or a woman who finds him or herself in the middle of a very down-to-earth conflict between different factions. The authoritarian Camelosians, who seek to tighten their grip on Avalon, the rebellious splinter faction within the Horns of the South who no longer acknowledge Camelot's authority, the various Dalriata tribes who have a bone to pick with Camelot, the local inhabitants of Kuanag who are reluctant to leave, etc. And then you have larger-than-life otherworldly entities who are playing their own game. You have King Arthur himself, who wants to be whole again because he wants to right the wrongs of his past and serve his kingdom. You have those who want to bring him back because this time they are going to get it right, and you have those who want to end him once and for all because they think, or at least that's what they say, that ending Arthur and leaving people to forge a new future is the only way to save the kingdom. And those are great bones for a story, a 10 out of 10 in my book. My problem is a little bit with how they did it. The story in Tainted Grail Conquest thrived on its exquisite wordcraft. The game never needed to resort to exposition dumps to explain what the weirdness was, for example. It was coded as subtext in each of the characters' individual stories, all of which revolved around the theme of guilt. This game had me wrapped around its fingers since the very beginning. There were passages that moved me to tears and moments that made me want to stand up and clap at the sheer brilliance with which it conveyed its concepts and themes. There was the Elder Archer, whose legs ended in roots that stretched into the ground and form a bonfire, because guilt is like a gnarled root that won't let go and it's always burning, consuming you. There was the huge abomination who walked about with people sticking out of its belly, because in life he used to be a despicable person who gained notoriety by claiming other people's merits as his own. I was very impressed at how the developers and writers of Tainted Grail Conquest used this surreal limbo they called the weirdness as a freestyle canvas of sorts that allowed them to make some pretty brutal and straightforward representations of the many faces of guilt. And that's why I was a little bit shocked in Tainted Grail the Fall of Avalon when I arrived to the Horns of the South and met this guy. The guy who wanted me to cook his mom's recipe because he was feeling nostalgic about her cuisine. Or the guy who wanted to wage war against the all-pooping seagulls. It felt like the Kafkian vibe and the mysticism of the first game had gone out the window for good. And I know that these games are very different and that Conquest's core premise couldn't have possibly sustained a 60-hour plus RPG, but I think they went a little too far in the opposite direction. Some characters in Tainted Grail the Fall of Avalon feel like they don't have a purpose beyond pointing you in the direction of a quest objective, or to serve as a plot device to advance the story. Also, the Fall of Avalon can be a little bit exposition-y from time to time when there was no need for it. Take for example this passage at the beginning of the game, in which Arthur finally introduced himself. Because the game wanted this moment to be big and epic, they went all in with the wow factor and made Arthur's soul, who had been nothing but a floating orb of blue light up until that point, morph into the impressive figure of the king himself, donning his legendary full body armor and all. Quite the display, I admit, and it came with all the bells, whistles, and epic music that the occasion called for. But see, the premise of the story is that Arthur is not whole again. Your goal, in fact, is to find the other fragments of his soul. And because of this, almost immediately after this flashy scene, that was there purely for the wow factor, Arthur's soul goes back to being a floating orb. So then the game is left with the uncomfortable task of explaining why he went back to being a floating orb of blue light. If the epic oh wow moment hadn't happened at all in the first place, said explanation wouldn't have been necessary, and a simple "I need your help to find the other fragments of my soul" would have sufficed. Now don't get me wrong, compared to the endless parade of shallow stories that are moved forward by the sheer power of the plot, the story in Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon is actually phenomenal, and some of its moments are downright glorious. For starters, the mystery aspect of the story keeps you invested all the way through, and I for one am thankful that the mystery is not prolonged through obfuscation or because the characters who know what is going on decide to keep this knowledge from you for some dumb reason, like, I don't have time to explain, or you wouldn't understand. The motivations behind the most important characters are reasonable and relatable, and the setting in which the story takes place feels like a tiny part of a much bigger world, a world that existed long before you came into it. I would also like to tell you guys about the humor in The Fall of Avalon.
I'm sorry, what?
Yup, believe it or not, there is a little bit of that thing they call humor in this game. My first experience with the Tainted Grail IP was Tainted Grail Conquest, and one thing I can say about that game is that it is dead fucking serious. It gives you almost zero moments of levity or humor, and the few times it does, there's always a grim, sour undertone to it. But that's not the case with The Fall of Avalon. Admittedly, the game got off the wrong foot with me in this respect, with all these dumb keepers giving me mean quests and wasting my time. It felt like it was trying too hard to be too funny too soon. But over the course of the game, I was surprised at how often I chuckled during some of the conversations. I like that humorous situations in this game are almost always a product of your interactions with people who are being ignorant, or naive, or obsessive, or high-nosed in the extreme. And that makes the game's humorous situations feel organic and never out of place. But the most impressive thing about the story in Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon is that more than once, I came upon a critical dialogue choice that made me wonder what was the right thing to do. Which is not a common occurrence because
I have come to the crossroads in my life. I always knew what the right path was. Without exception, I knew.
But in Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon, it was not always that easy, because in this game,
All men are guilty. And innocent.
and I can definitely appreciate that. You also have to give credit to the writers for seamlessly making the story revolve around the classic motifs of Arthurian Dark Fantasy, like the cyclical nature of Arthur's rise and fall, and the depiction of a world where even the most noble intentions can have devastating consequences. So while I miss the way in which the original game handled its theme and its world building, while The Fall of Avalon had nothing that came even remotely close to steering something inside me the way the stories of Futhark or The Scientist did in Conquest, I still enjoyed the story very much in Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon. It still packed a heavy punch with its subtext, it was still chock-a-block with food for thought and poignant metaphors, and it did leave me curious about the game's other endings, which is always a good sign. Companions lore-wise.
There aren't any!
Companions gameplay-wise.
There aren't any!
Secondary mechanics and user experience. In addition to combat, exploration, and questing, Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon features a pretty standard array of secondary mechanics: trading, inventory management, handcrafting, cooking, alchemy, sketching, and bonfires to be precise. And just like a good sauce is meant to bring out the flavor of a meal, secondary mechanics should serve to elevate the quality of those aspects of the gameplay mix that constitute the core of the experience. And in Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon, they do just that. Trade works much like you'd expect in a game of the genre, though I personally wish it had been a little bit more immersive. Vendors have infinite money to buy all the shit you need to get rid of, and they are equally interested in all items, regardless of whether or not they have to do with their line of work. I find it funny that Orleith, the vendor at the Horns of the South, has garlic, onions, and other vegetables on display, but they aren't available for purchase. But these are of course very minor nitpicks. There is also cooking in Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon. Food can make a substantial difference in combat in this game, and you can't even make it a part of your build because the practicality skill tree has a couple of passives that improves the effects of your meals, which is absolutely awesome. In Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon, you have an insane amount of food that you can use as ingredients for more elaborate dishes. There's venison, poultry, fish, cabbage, you name it. You find a lot of recipes over the course of your adventure that help you make the most out of all this food, and some of them are quite hard to find. And you can also experiment with ingredients if you want. But cooking is also a bit of a wasted opportunity in this game. First, you don't have hunger meters, and I think the adventure aspect of the game would have been much greater if it did. Second, the only difference between most of the dishes that you can prepare in the game is the amount of health and stamina that they replenish. Take for example Outward. Meals did all sorts of things for you in that game. There were meals that increased your resistance to cold or heat, there were meals that made you hit harder, there were meals that made you more resistant to damage, there were meals that slowed the rate at which your stamina and mana went down, there were meals that made you run faster, others that helped you cure disease, etc, etc, etc. And I think Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon could have used a little bit of that. There is also handcrafting in this game, which essentially works like blacksmithing and leatherworking combined. You can create new items, you can upgrade the items that you already have, you can optimize their weight, and you can socket relics into them. But this aspect of the game feels significantly lacking when compared to, say, Skyrim. And the difference is that in Skyrim, your progress as a blacksmith depended on your dedication to your craft. You needed to go out there and farm crafting materials. You needed to spend time at the forge. There was even a proper animation for it. You made items that were actually useful compared to the gear you found out in the world. And because it was a skill tree, you could set your eyes on the coveted prize of the draconic or dradic armor, and you could see the path that you had to follow to get there. It was awesome, really. In Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon, like in many other games, the gear that you get from killing elite monsters and bosses is usually a lot better than anything you can craft. Handcrafting is partially tied to quest lines, and the stuff that you craft as part of said quest lines is terribly shitty. A lamellar armor that doesn't work because it's part of a meme quest, bird traps for seagulls that have no use because they are part of a meme quest, a fur coat that you can't use because it's part of a meme quest, an axe with shitty stats, some bullshit stones that sing. What the fuck, game? Is this some kind of joke to you? You can also upgrade your armor, but the upgrades don't go beyond flat increment of X or Y stat, which is boring as fuck. Socketing relics, however, is where this discipline truly shines, because there are a lot of relics that can be found in this game, and they can be used to further customize your items so that they synergize better with your character's build. And I think this is awesome-ish. Not Diablo 2 levels of awesome, with all the skulls, gems, runes, and jewels that you had in that game, but awesome-ish. Alchemy is pretty decent. Potions do all sorts of things in this game, and they can make a world of difference in combat, especially since you can do the Skyrim thing of pausing the game during combat, opening up your inventory and drinking potions till you're back to 100% health. Hey, it's not very immersive, but I'll take it. Those insane difficulty spikes sure make me glad I have this option. Also, there is this one part of the game that I still don't know what I would have done to get through if I hadn't resorted to alchemy, and I find that awesome. Bonfires in this game work like a camp of sorts, and this is a very nice addition. One thing that I didn't like about games, like Dragon's Dogma and Elex amongst many others, was that you couldn't rest wherever you wanted. These games had day-night cycles and nighttime felt actually dangerous, which was cool. But because there weren't any camp mechanics, you were forced to either plan your longer trips around the game's day-night cycle to avoid having to travel during nighttime, or pinpoint the location of camps and other places where there were beds for you to spend the night. But in Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon, you can set up camp anywhere you want as long as you have the right materials, and that includes cobwebs to keep the weirdness away, which are precious hard to find, and that's a good thing, by the way. Sketching is a thing in this game, but I never figured out its purpose beyond the coolness of having the ability to make a charcoal rendition of a nice view that you could later sell to a merchant for 1 gold coin. They could have shown a reel with your drawings during the credits, that would have been nice. You also have a bunch of activities that you can do to farm resources like fishing, mining, and woodcutting, but I think those are pretty self-explanatory. As for the game's UX, the game's main mechanics feel good, combat feels tight and weighty, and both pew-pew and non-pew-pew magic feel satisfying to use. You can't strafe in this game though, this has to be said. I personally don't care too much about it, but some people might. Your summons are a little bit jankier than I would have liked. Sometimes they refuse to engage the bad guys, and the toughest enemies with this build are vertical structures with narrow staircases and ramps. I'm not a fan of the stupid console-y action wheel mechanic, but the good news is that you don't really need to use it, except for bonfires, and you don't use those during combat, so it's fine. I very strongly dislike how console-y inventory and trade mechanics are in this game. Why do you need to click on an item slot that takes you to a menu that shows the items that you can equip on that slot? Give me character on the left, items on the right, drag and drop, that's it. Give me filters and tabs if you want to make it friendlier, give me tooltips, give me vis-a-vis item comparison windows, and that's it. Also, the sort by weight function should take into account the global weight of your grouped items, not the individual weight of each item, in my opinion. I want my PC user-friendly UI back, and that's that. Sound effects and mix. This is quite satisfying, and it has been since day one, but it's definitely not perfect. Weapons make different sounds depending on the type of damage they do and on the type of armor the enemy is wearing. But this is not entirely consistent. Crits, for example, tend to make a metallic sound even when you are using spells, and that is a bit confusing. Bow and arrow attacks sound especially awesome, as some of you pointed out on CBS, and those crits, man, those crits are badass. The sound that spells make are also pretty good, but nothing that'll make you say, oh wow, or fuck yeah. I like that they added proper resonance to every sound when you are in an underground area like a cave or a dungeon. This game has a lot of otherworldly locations, and these guys have a master's degree when it comes to making those places sound ethereal, dangerous, and eerie. And when the weirdness comes at night, it sounds harrowing. The verticality of the sound isn't perfect, and sometimes it can be a little bit stressful, but it's not terrible. Footsteps sound adequately different depending on the surface you're walking on, and this includes the occasional splotchy sound of your footsteps when it's raining. The sound design is not elaborate really. Take for example opening a chest in Avowed. Note how the action of putting your left hand on the chest and the action of opening the chest each have their own sound with different intensities and different panning. There's nothing like that here, but I still think the sound gets the job done. Music.
Far
the type of soundtrack that stays with me for a long time. A couple of years ago, I got the original soundtrack for Tainted Grail Conquest, and I listened to it for months, and I intend to do the same thing with this one. Arthurian Dark Fantasy is not an easy beast to tackle, but Tainted Grail nails it as an IP. In fact, it pretty much beats the crap out of how I imagined everything, and this includes the music. And like many other aspects of the game, it gets a lot better as it goes. There are a couple of tracks that play in the final region of the game that made me take a break just to appreciate the whole art package that I was seeing and listening to. The music in this game not only delivers an atmosphere of mystery and foreboding, but to me at least, pieces like the one we get in the title screen tell the story of Arthur himself, the once and future king who seeks to come back to his kingdom to ensure its prosperity, and the dark forces who seek to corrupt him and turn him into a device for their own plans. And fuck yeah, Radar from Tainted Grail Conquest is back, though only for one boss fight, but I still had to pause to do my little Clotar dance. It says Clotar, by the way, nothing you'll ever say will convince me otherwise. This is an absolutely fantastic work of art, and even if the game doesn't look like something you'd like to play, I would still recommend that you check out the soundtrack because it's simply
amazing.
Voice acting.
And I will be happy to introduce you. I'd also like to bring your attention.
If you want to use my kitchen, go ahead, help yourself, but don't you dare prepare anything mundane, like pancakes or scrambled eggs.
Ah, the horns of the south. The crown jewel of these lands. We had barely laid the foundations of Tintergel when Seawall and his men had already built a lighthouse, eager to guide our ships to them. He always had a competitive spirit. Of course, it helped that he took every sailor from the homelands with him, along with a handful of knights, so they could learn from one another.
This is all over the fucking place. You have the good, the bad, and the ugly all rolled into one. But it leans a little bit towards the bad, I think. You have characters with good voice acting like Captain Brendan, Lady Elisa, and of course Arthur himself, all of whom come off as people with actual personalities. But you also have your share of planks of wood like Quartermaster Feargas and some other characters that are spectacularly bad, like this guy at the local All-Mother Volker temple. One of the biggest issues that I have with the voice acting is that everyone sounds like they come from a different place. It's like the voice director couldn't decide if he or she wanted characters to sound Scottish, Irish, English, or like non-English speakers. So he or she asked everyone to do a different accent. The result is that not even people who are part of the same family sound alike. Also, it's baffling how many words are pronounced so differently by so many people. Is it matter, mother, mother, mother? Is it kunacht, kuanacht, or kanacht? Is it thoid, thode, or third? But the worst offender has to be the Dalriata. How the hell do you pronounce this? Because even among people who are part of this culture, it's
Dalriata
or
Dalrita.
depending on who you ask. And no, it has nothing to do with the different Dalriata tribes. The way the Dalriata pronounce the name of their own people is inconsistent even amongst people who are part of the same tribe. Overall, it's not black book levels of bad, but it's not great either. At least the most important characters go from decent to awesome. Graphics. When it comes to graphics, I don't care about resolution, I don't care about DLSS support, I don't care about any of these things as long as the game plays smoothly. I do care about the art, however. I like games that have a strong artistic personality and cohesive visuals. I care about the immersion and world building aspects of a game. I care about living spaces looking lived in. I care about clothes and garments being consistent with the wearer's job, hierarchy, place of origin, and condition. I care about believable architecture and believable topography. Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon gets most of these things right. Like I've said before, this is a game that gets Arthurian Dark Fantasy right, and most of it has to do with the game's visuals. Locations look believable and consistent with the game's setting, and the blend of cultures that coexist there. Otherworldly realms are the absolute standouts though. They are awe-inspiring, intriguing, fascinating even. Despite not being as detailed as the ones in higher profile AA and AAA games, locations in Tainted Grail do a superb job of creating an atmosphere of eeriness and danger. Some places rank super high in the creep factor, to the point that they made me genuinely scared. Take this location for example. It made me want to do the thing I needed to do there as soon as possible and get the fuck out. And it wasn't even that dangerous. My only problem with locations in this game is that there aren't enough settlements in the first two regions of the game. The first region is particularly lacking. The Horns of the South is decent, but it doesn't feel like a proper city the way cities do in Skyrim. The city of Kuanacht in the second region is much better. There are a lot of houses, buildings, stores, bridges, secret passageways, etc. But it's only one city. And the Forlorn Swords has various Dalriata settlements, but they are a little more than a collection of houses, even if the level design is quite interesting in some cases. Clothes, armor, and gear aren't super detailed, but they are consistent with the game's lore and with the wearer's role, ethnicity, or status depending on the case. And there is a good enough variety of clothes and garments. Some of the clothes you pick up along the way push the boundaries of cross-dressing even. Human character models look a little bit dated and lacking in detail, and hairs look especially bad in medium and lower settings. Monsters and animals look pretty good, and there's a decent variety to go around. The user interface is pretty much your standard modern day UI. It's not trying to be immersive or seamless, but practical and useful, but I don't think it entirely succeeds for the reasons we already talked about. Despite all the negative little nitpicks that I talked about pertaining to the graphic aspect of the game, Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon delivers a world that is worth exploring, a setting that you want to know more about, and a mystery that compels you to get to the bottom of it. And I think the game's graphics play an important part in all of this. Performance and stability. It's not as terrible as some people say, but it's also not great. Loading times are a little bit too long, though not terrible. The game froze for a bit every time I saved. There were some funny meme-worthy glitches here and there. Horseback riding is clunky and slow to the point of not being worth it. And summons? Summons. They deserve a video of their own, these summons. Every time you have a conversation, they keep pushing you and the NPC you're talking to around. One time they pushed me into a closet and I couldn't even get out when the conversation was over. It felt as though they were saying, "You're the skeleton in the closet now, bitch." They also keep getting teleported right in front of you, forcing you to run around them, which is especially irritating when you are riding a horse, and most especially annoying when you're going through narrow corridors or walking on planks. They make your life miserable when you are looting or just trying to go up a staircase, and they sometimes fail to engage some of the enemies, as we said. Bottom line is, if it weren't for the fact that they are pretty freaking awesome in combat, I would hate them. Also, my particular way of killing this boss resulted in a bug that locked me out of completing the quest or even leaving the location in which the fight takes place. It took me a few attempts to figure out what was going on. Figuring out the bug felt good, but it shouldn't have happened. I think that compared to the state in which other open world games were released, Tainted Grail looks and performs pretty decently. Also, I have tried to make some videos to tell the devs about some of the problems that I've encountered, but by the time I am done with the video, they've already fixed the issue, which means they are working diligently to improve the game. Still, yes, it could have been better from the get-go. Other considerations and final thoughts. Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon has been labeled the Arthurian Skyrim, and technically it is not a bad description. If nothing else, the Oblivion remaster proved this year that there is a post-Daggerfall Elder Scrolls itch that a lot of people desperately want scratched. And Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon might just be the game to do the trick. But to me, there is a lot more to this game than just that. To me, Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon does not thrive solely on the fact that it delivers a gaming experience comparable to the one you got from the Elder Scrolls series. It's a unique take on Arthurian fantasy that takes place in an intriguing world, a world in which arcane supernatural beings and obscure druidic magics intertwine with the darkest demons of human nature. It features morally ambiguous characters, and it has you journeying through a kingdom that never really lived up to the vision of its founder. And you have been burdened with the task of bringing him back so that he gets one more chance to set things right. And at the same time, you have been asked to play your part to bring his cycle of resurrection to an end. Both of these missions feel larger than life, and by the time you see one or the other through to the end, chances are you'll label them as memorable passages in your mental recollection of gaming moments. And for all of this, Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon is not only one of my favorite games this year, but one of the most rewarding games I've played in the 2020s, and one of the best games in the last 10 years. And that's why it gets a solid recommendation from yours truly. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, thank you for watching all the way up until now. If you like what you are seeing on this channel, please consider subscribing and clicking that notification bell to avoid the usual YouTube shenanigans. Come check us out on Discord if you don't mind all the boomer talk that goes on there. I personally love it and wouldn't change it for anything. And share the video if you thought it was cool. Bye everyone.
You're excused. You can go back to playing video games.